What were Darth Sidious's final words to his master? Greetings, students of the Force, and welcome back to the archives. One of the most important moments in any Rule of Two Sith's life is the moment that they overthrow their master and take their place as the Dark Lord. Whether through clever tactics such as poisoning and happy accidents, or by way of more direct means such as an open challenge, the claiming of the title of master is an incredibly special ceremony for the apprentice. It's a once-in-a-lifetime moment, and just as the Sith are known to do, they may have a final few words prepared for their dear master. Sidious, on the other hand, though, had an entire monologue in the final chapter of the Darth Plagueis novelization. When all things had reached their fruition and climax, Palpatine decided to kill his master. But he makes sure that Plagueis' death is slow and painful. The whole time the moon dies, Palpatine performs a speech from the bottom of his blackened heart. In this rare moment, we get to actually see the truest and most unfiltered version of Darth Sidious. A private few moments where he decides to be his real self and speak truthfully. A rare moment indeed. So join us today as we open another Sith holocron and go over this dramatic and oddly touching final words that Palpatine gave to his master, Darth Plagueis. The scene of course takes place within Palpatine's penthouse suite. Plagueis is passed out drunk on the couch after a night of celebrating once Palpatine is elected as Supreme Chancellor. Maul is currently out on Naboo, and the two Sith Lords believe that their plans have reached victory. Palpatine had rehearsed his acceptance speech several times to the point where Plagueis ended up falling asleep in a drunken stupor. Right as the newly elected Chancellor was about to leave though, the dark side of the Force interrupted him and hissed within his ear. It told him that he was completely alone with his master, and there was no one around. He was helpless, and there would be no better opportunity to finally take what was rightfully Palpatine's. Listening to the voice of the dark side, Sidious moved in a blur, lashing out in a web of force lightning, immediately damaging Plagueis' breathing apparatus. Ever since having his throat slit by an assassin years earlier, Plagueis had to wear a respirator mask over his mouth in order to sustain his life. Its circuits were immediately damaged by Sidious' barrage of lightning, cleverly weakening the Sith Master so that he could not fight back effectively. Of course, Plagueis immediately woke, but he was far too slow to react, leaving him gasping on the floor. At this moment, Palpatine would launch into his final speech, which would go on for the next 2 pages of the book. With a snarl, the first thing he goes into is how Higo Damask, the alter ego of Plagueis, had originally come to Naboo in order to sap it dry of its plasma resources, only to stumble upon a much greater prize, a young, disturbed boy who he took advantage of. And this is how Palpatine begins. It was Higo Damask as Plagueis who had then set their sights on the seemingly confused young man, and with meticulous skill, manipulated him into committing patricide, matricide, and fratricide. Plagueis who took him as an apprentice, sharing some of his knowledge, but withholding his most powerful secrets, denying the apprentice his wishes as a means of controlling him, instilling in him a sense of murderous rage, and turning him to the dark side. It's extremely interesting how Sidious starts by talking about where it all began. By the context of the chapter, it's difficult to tell whether Sidious is saying this out of resentment or talking about things factually. He is gnarling in rage and hatred the entire time, so it's safe to say that he is likely speaking out of a place of old wounds. We never really see Palpatine feel any regret for killing his family, but here, he acknowledges it is a product of Darth Plagueis' manipulation. However, in true Sidious fashion, that part takes a backseat to the apparently more important issue of Plagueis keeping him from growing as rapidly in power as he could have. And that's when Palpatine launches into a tirade about the grievances in his training. It's unlike anything we've seen for a Sith to actually speak about the trauma that they have suffered during training years, and actually air it to their master that inflicted it upon them. But in this moment, Palpatine allows himself to speak from probably the most vulnerable part of himself, to get revenge on how he was treated. Let's continue reading. It was Plagueis who criticized the early efforts of his apprentice, and once choked him in a demonstration of his superiority. Plagueis, who denigrated him in private for hiring an inept assassin to carry out the murder of Senator Kim, and yet, who allowed himself to be tricked by the Gran and nearly killed by mercenaries. Plagueis, who turned away from the grand plan to focus entirely on himself, in an egotistical quest for immortality. Plagueis, who had the temerity to criticize his apprentice for having inculcated too much pride in the assassin that he had trained. Plagueis, who had attempted to turn his equally powerful apprentice into a messenger, a mere intermediary, and Plagueis, who watched in secret while his apprentice tasked their true intermediary to reveal the Sith reborn to the galaxy. In the latter portion of the section, Sidious finally calls out Plagueis for practically abandoning him to carry out the Rule of Two, as Plagueis became a recluse within his laboratory, obsessing over the midichlorians. It's pretty rich that Sidious's master continued to judge and harshly correct him over the way that he trained Maul, while Darth Plagueis himself wasn't even involved in the plan any longer, while Sidious was out doing the actual work, schmoozing politicians, setting up the Naboo crisis, and dealing with the slimy Trade Federation, all while secretly campaigning for Supreme Chancellor. Plagueis was off taking a holiday to study his experiments, treating Palpatine, lesser, as an errand boy. It was an insulting use of his abilities and his accomplishments, made all the worse when Plagueis took the credit and planned for Sidious to take him on as co-chancellor whenever he was elected. All the while, the master never sensed that his apprentice had long since outgrown him, something Palpatine confirms with the next string of insults. Plagueis the Wise, who in his time truly was, except at the end, trusting that the Rule of Two had been superseded, and failed to realize that he would not be excused from it. Plagueis the Wise, who forged the most powerful Sith Lord in the galaxy, the greatest the galaxy has ever known, and yet who forgot to leave a place for himself, whose pride never allowed him to question that he would no longer be needed. How often you said that the old order of Bane had ended with the death of your master. An apprentice no longer needs to be stronger, you told me, merely more clever. The era of keeping score, suspicion, and betrayal was over. Strength is not the flesh, but in the Force. Sidious laughed. You lost the game on the very first day you chose to train me to rule by your side. Or better still, under your thumb. Teacher, yes, and for that, I will be eternally grateful. But master, never. Finally, Plagueis picks himself up off of the floor, but only collapses back onto the couch, trying desperately to gather his own Force power to mount a counterattack. But unfortunately, he was far too weak due to his breathing mask. Sidious decides to deprive him of air even further, choking him and continuing with his speech. Sidious would go on to mock Plagueis for attempting to gather his midichlorians in order to save his life. He then went on to say that he didn't intend on saving him or keeping him around the way that Plagueis had with Venomous. Instead of bringing him to death's door and pulling him back, Palpatine stated that he intended to shove his master through it. At that point, he gives the classic line of how it was a tragedy that Plagueis could oversee the lives and deaths of everyone else, but never himself. And for the penultimate section of his speech, Palpatine lets his master know just in the same way that he had clouded the minds of the Jedi, that he had clouded Plagueis' mind as well. Never once did he have any intention of sharing power with Plagueis. He just needed to learn his secrets. No more, no less. Palpatine then gloats about how all the ideas that Plagueis had were never really his, actually just Sidious's that he planted within his master's mind to get what he wanted. Around this time, he could feel that Plagueis was beginning to slip away and die. He was barely alive and would rapidly be leaving this world soon. And so Palpatine decided to wrap up with this. For even after all you taught me, I might not have been able to take the final steps to the chancellorship without your help in manipulating the Senate and bringing into play your various and sundry allies. If it's any consolation, I'm being honest when I say that I could not have succeeded without you. But now that we've won the race, I've no need for a co-chancellor. Your presence, much less your unnecessary counsel, would only serve to confuse matters. I have Maul to do what the risk of discovery may not allow me to do, while I execute the rest of the grand plan, growing an army, fomenting rebellion, and fabricating intergalactic war, quarreling the Jedi, and catching them unaware. Rest easy in your grave, Plagueis. In the end, I will be proclaimed Emperor. The Sith will have their revenge, and I will rule the galaxy. In a strangely personal moment, Palpatine eschews most of his earlier bravado and levels with his dying master in nothing but truth, the man who truly was the only one to be a friend to Palpatine in his early years. He tells him that he couldn't have gotten that far without him, and in his final few lines, we feel a wholehearted promise in a strange, twisted way. Palpatine is comforting Plagueis with his final words. He seems to console his master, letting him know that he was going to make sure their work reached its completion. We rarely ever get to see any sort of human moments from Sidious that aren't just pure manipulation. He doesn't often speak to Vader on a real level at all, and seems to only show his real self to himself. But I believe in this moment, we get to see the last vestiges of Palpatine's human side, the side that actually would go out of his way to give some comforting words to a man who had truly impacted his life in a profound way. Palpatine gave credit where credit was due, both to Plagueis' training and his political efforts. When he said he didn't need Plagueis any longer at this point, it was just a matter of fact. Seeing Sidious be 100% genuine is just so compelling, since we essentially never see this in the lore, and there is always an ulterior motive. But not here. It makes sense for a Sith to only show their true face whenever they're speaking to someone who is about to die. Despite this being a grisly murder, Palpatine's speech is so much more than a self-indulgent monologue. In a strange way, he speaks from the inner self that never got to have a voice. He talks about the way he was twisted as a child into unleashing a monster, one that he would never regain control of. He talks about how he was physically and emotionally mistreated, and then held back from his potential. The frustrations that came with the Master and the Rule of Two, who did not want to be succeeded, made Palpatine struggle as an apprentice much harder than any apprentice before him. But just like all Sith with their masters, this is a distinct love-hate relationship. Palpatine loathes Plagueis for all of these things, and yet he can't help but concede to his master that he had truly given him the tools to become the Emperor. Ruling was the only thing that Sidious ever truly loved, and there was one man who set him on that path to accomplish everything that he ever desired, and that was Darth Plagueis the Wise. That was the man that was dying before him. In a way, Palpatine may have strangely loved him, not the way that you or I feel love, rather an appreciation, a profound respect, and yet also knew that Plagueis' time was over, and the reign of Sidious would soon begin. A final, heartfelt moment between two of the most powerful Sith Lords that ever lived, and the culmination of the Rule of Two.